Good morning. Let's start with some good news. In virtually every aspect of our society, we're making extraordinary progress. In technology, in healthcare, in clean energy. But there is one domain in which we're becoming steadily less capable, and that's self-governance. Our politics are becoming so divisive and so dysfunctional that we can't seem to solve major national challenges. And even worse, once bedrock democratic institutions like free and fair elections have been called into open question. So voters are angry, they're alienated, and I think they have every right to be. So why are our politics so broken? Well, you don't have to pay close attention to realize that our institutions are not seeming to represent us. And if you ask most people why that is, they might point to the politicians themselves. They're so radical, they're divisive, they may even be corrupt. And in some cases, they may not be wrong. But do you ever wonder how they got into office in the first place, or why they behave the way that they do? I'd argue that we don't have a politician's problem as much as we have an elections problem. In fact, the biggest solvable one has been hiding in plain sight, and that's partisan primaries, or what I call the primary problem. In fact, if you were to give me a choice today between replacing all 535 members of Congress or changing the way that those members get reelected, I would choose the latter, and it isn't even close. And that's because if we can solve this primary problem, we can change the incentives by which those politicians get elected. Tom Friedman once remarked on this topic, saying that if you move the cheese, you can move the mouse. I first began to realize this when I ran for Congress, where I'm from in Northeast Pennsylvania in 2014. And as if running as the youngest candidate that cycle wasn't enough of a challenge, I also decided to run as an independent candidate, because I didn't fit easily on either Team Donkey or Team Elephant. What's interesting is that when I went to go knock on doors without having to wear a red or blue jersey, people let their defenses down. And so I was able to talk to thousands of my neighbors and find common ground on the issues that they care about. That led me to appreciate that the true tragedy of American politics is not that we, the people, are hopelessly divided. It's that our leaders remain divided even when we can find agreement. I ran for Congress because I believe my congressman represented this problem. But I learned through that race that problem runs much, much deeper. Let's just take my congressional district, for example. The first problem was one of partisan gerrymandering. The state legislature drew my district so that it would virtually always elect a Republican. The only question was, which Republican would it elect? And that question is not decided in the November election. That question is decided months earlier in the party primary. The second problem was that Pennsylvania is one of 15 states with closed party primaries. And what that means is that Democrats only can vote in the Democratic primary, Republicans can only vote in the Republican primary, and if you're one of the 1.2 million independent voters, you can't vote at all in either taxpayer-funded primary. So those who can and do vote tend to be the most partisan and ideological voters, known as the party base. The third and final challenge was that to win the primary, or the general election for that matter, candidates only need to win the most votes, or a plurality, even when in a multi-candidate race, that plurality may only be 35%. They don't need to win a majority. If you combine those three things, partisan gerrymandering, closed primaries, and plurality winners, what do you get? You get my congressman. In 2010, he won election with just 5% of eligible voters in my district because that's all who voted in the party primary. And that's the core challenge that we face today in these low turnout elections. In 2013, when he voted to shut down the government, which is what led me to run for office in the first place, he wasn't trying to represent a true majority of my district. He was only pandering to the slim faction of voters that would decide that primary. And guess what? It worked. I lost that race, but I learned a valuable lesson. And that lesson is that the biggest problem in our politics is not who we elect, it's how we elect them. Because my district is not unique. 83% of congressional districts today are so heavily skewed to either the Democratic or the Republican primary that the primary is the only election that matters. You win the primary, you win the general. And in the last election, only 8% of voters nationally decided those primaries. So you get 8% of Americans electing 83% of Congress. 8% elect 83%. So if you ever wonder why it seems like Congress doesn't represent a majority of us, it's because it literally does not. What's worse is that partisan activists and special interests have hijacked and weaponized this system to advance their own narrow agendas. In the same year that I ran for office, the Republican House Majority Leader Eric Cantor was defeated in his own Republican primary. Why? He was open to considering parts of the bipartisan immigration reform bill that passed the Senate, including a path to legal status for Dreamers. And that enraged the Tea Party base in his district. 4 years later, Democratic leader Joe Crowley was primaried out of office by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She campaigned on abolishing ICE with the backing of a group called the Justice Democrats. Fewer than 17,000 people voted for her in her primary in a district of over 700,000, but that's all that was required to win that election. And so the message to other Democrats and Republicans in Congress, even the most powerful ones, is clear. If you step out of line with your party base or you work across the aisle to solve a problem, you might be next. And so they don't. And so nothing gets done. And that's why Congress has a 12% approval rating, but over 90% get reelected. Because of our election system, our politicians get to keep their jobs even when they don't do their jobs. The good news now is that this primary problem is entirely solvable. Primaries are not written into our Constitution. Our founding fathers feared the rise of political parties to begin with. It wasn't until a little over 100 years ago that primaries were invented out of whole cloth to replace the old system, which was the smoke-filled rooms and the party bosses handpicking the candidates. Well, guess what? That new system isn't working out very well for us today. And so it's time, once again, that we upgrade it. And that's become my mission through Unite America. Solving the primary problem doesn't require a constitutional amendment. It doesn't require an act of Congress. The solution can be enacted at the state level through either legislatures or through ballot initiatives by changing two simple things about our elections. The first is that we want to replace closed primaries with elections in which every eligible voter has the right to vote for any candidate regardless of party. The second is that instead of plurality winner, we want candidates to be required to win majority support to get elected. 3 out of 4 Americans of all political stripes agree with these two ideas. And 5 states have already adopted some version of reform that reflect these ideas, including Louisiana, Nebraska, Washington, and California. And in 2020, Alaska became the latest state to adopt the most powerful version of this reform. Voters there adopted a ballot initiative that adopted a top 4 nonpartisan primary and an instant runoff general election. I'm going to explain both parts, and hopefully you'll see why this system is much better than the way most of us vote today. In the primary, instead of having to choose between a Democratic or Republican ballot, all voters get a single all-candidate ballot. You choose your favorite candidate, and the top 4 finishers who get the most votes advance to the general election. And in the general election, you have the option of ranking those candidates according to preference. When it comes time to determine the election results, if a candidate wins a majority of first-choice votes, they win. If no candidate wins a majority of first-choice votes, there's an instant runoff. An instant runoff is just like a traditional runoff, but instead of asking voters to come back to the polls to decide between the top finishers, they've already made known their backup choices, and those choices are instantly tabulated to determine a majority winner. These two changes in Alaska, the top 4 nonpartisan primary and the instant runoff general election, dramatically changed both how candidates ran and how those winners govern under this new system. Take Republican State Senator Kathy Gizel as just one example. In her first few elections, she would get a list from the Republican Party of which voters to target in her campaign. And those voters were the Republican primary voters because her primary was the only election that mattered, and therefore those voters were the only election that mattered. And that worked out pretty well for her until 2020, when she lost her primary because she was working in a bipartisan fashion in the state legislature. Now comes 2022 under the new election system, and what does Kathy do? She throws out the old voter lists and instead knocks on every door in her district. She was able to build a coalition of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, and she was reelected. And in addition to that, when she got to the state legislature, she formed a bipartisan caucus with other members. She became the majority leader of that caucus, and they decided to put the divisive issues aside and to work on the issues that could unite most Alaskans. Now, I want you to imagine, what would our democracy, what would our Congress look like today if more states were to follow suit? For every state that abolishes party primaries, we can liberate 2 more US senators, several more US representatives from the grips of the primary problem to put country over party and work on the issues that we all care about. What I'm proposing is not complicated. If we want Congress to stop acting crazy, let's not reward members of Congress who act crazy. If we want a Congress that represents a majority of us, let's have elections that are decided by a true majority of us. If we're not happy with the status quo, let's change it. You know, the American experiment is the greatest experiment in self-governance in all of human history. But it is just that. It's an experiment. When our founders designed our system of government, they knew it would not be perfect, but they gave us the tools to help perfect it. That has been our tradition, and today it remains our task. Thank you.